Lieutenant Grace Sullivan had never been the loudest voice in the room. At 32 years old, she carried herself with a calm reserve that some mistook for weakness. Her slight frame and gentle manner seemed out of place among the hardened soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Battalion stationed at Fort Carson, Colorado. The other officers noticed this disconnect, and not all of them kept their observations private. "Sullivan's too soft for combat leadership," Captain Derek Morton said one evening in the officers' mess, his voice just loud enough to carry. "She belongs behind a desk, not leading troops into hostile territory." Grace heard the comment. She always did. But she'd learned long ago that words were just noise. What mattered was action, and she'd proven herself capable in every training exercise, every simulation, every test the Army threw at her. Still, the whispers followed her like shadows. She came from Millbrook, a small town in upstate New York where everyone knew everyone else's business. Her father had been a mailman, her mother a school librarian. Nothing in her background screamed warrior. She joined the Army on academic scholarship, studied strategic operations, and worked her way up through sheer determination and an almost photographic memory for tactics and terrain. But respect didn't come from test scores in the military. It came from blood, sweat, and proving yourself when everything fell apart. The deployment orders came in late September. The battalion would be heading to a contested region near the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, an area where insurgent activity had recently spiked. Grace's platoon consisted of 24 soldiers, a mix of veterans and young troops on their first deployment. She knew each one by name, knew their families, their fears, their strengths. During the pre-deployment briefing, Colonel Patricia Hendricks outlined their mission: establish a forward observation post in the mountains, monitor enemy movements, and provide intelligence for larger operations. It was supposed to be relatively straightforward, emphasis on supposed to be. "Lieutenant Sullivan will lead the insertion team," the colonel announced. The room fell silent. Grace felt the weight of every eye turning toward her. Captain Morton cleared his throat, a sound heavy with skepticism. "Ma'am, with respect," Morton began, "shouldn't we assign someone with more field experience to lead the initial push?" Colonel Hendricks's expression hardened. "Lieutenant Sullivan has my full confidence, Captain. Unless you're questioning my judgment?" "No, ma'am," Morton replied, but his tone suggested otherwise. That night, Grace sat alone in her quarters, reviewing maps and intelligence reports until her eyes burned. She knew what everyone thought. She'd always known. But doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when 24 lives would depend on her decisions. Sergeant Paul Bennett, her second-in-command, knocked on her door around midnight. He was a grizzled veteran of 3 deployments, a man who'd seen more combat than most soldiers ever would. Grace had worried he'd resent serving under her, but he'd proven to be her strongest supporter. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, settling into a chair across from her desk. "Going over the routes again," Grace said, pointing to the topographical map spread before her. "Something feels off about the recommended approach. The valley route seems too obvious, too exposed." Bennett leaned forward, studying the map. "You thinking ambush territory?" "I'm thinking if I were the enemy, that's exactly where I'd wait." They spent the next 2 hours developing an alternative route, one that would take longer but offered better cover and defensive positions. It was the kind of careful planning that saved lives, but Grace knew it wouldn't matter to her critics. They'd already decided who she was. 3 weeks later, Grace's platoon boarded the transport helicopters. The morning air was cold and sharp, cutting through their gear. She looked at each of her soldiers as they loaded in, young faces trying to hide their fear. Veterans wearing masks of calm experience. "Stay sharp, stay together," she told them over the helicopter's roar. "We watch each other's backs. That's how we all come home." The helicopters lifted off, carrying them toward the mountains, toward the mission that would define Grace Sullivan's entire life, toward a nightmare that would strip away 24 souls and leave only one standing. But in that moment, as the Colorado landscape fell away beneath them, Grace allowed herself one small hope, that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally earn the respect that had always eluded her. She had no way of knowing that respect would come at a cost no human should ever have to pay. The insertion went smoothly at first. Too smoothly, Grace thought, as her platoon established their position on a rocky ridge overlooking the valley. The intelligence reports had predicted minimal enemy presence in this sector, but her instincts, honed by countless hours of study and simulation, screamed warnings that her ears couldn't yet hear. It was late afternoon on their second day when everything changed. Corporal Danny Martinez was on watch, scanning the valley below through his scope. "Left 10, I've got movement. Southwest ridge, multiple contacts." Grace moved to his position, bringing up her own binoculars. What she saw made her blood run cold. It wasn't a small patrol. It was an army. "Count?" she asked, keeping her voice level. "I'm seeing, Jesus, Lieutenant, at least 200 hostiles, maybe more. They're moving in formation, and they're heading straight for us." Sergeant Bennett appeared at her shoulder. "That's not what Intel predicted." "Intel was wrong," Grace said flatly. She grabbed the radio. "Falcon Base, this is Sullivan. We have eyes on massive hostile force. Grid coordinates November 732. Request immediate extraction and air support." Static crackled. Then a voice. "Sullivan, Falcon Base. Confirm hostile count?" "Minimum 200 heavily armed, moving with military precision. This isn't insurgent space. This is a trained force." More static. The delay felt eternal. "Sullivan, nearest air support is 40 minutes out. Extraction helicopter can be on station in 25 minutes. Recommend you hold position and wait for evac." Grace looked at the approaching force, then at the rocky terrain around their position. 25 minutes might as well be 25 hours. "Negative, Falcon Base. They'll be on us in 15 minutes. We need to move now." She turned to Bennett. "Get everyone ready to move. We're taking the Eastern Pass, double time." "That pass is a narrow choke point," Bennett said. "If they catch us there, if we stay here, we're dead for certain." Grace interrupted. "The pass gives us a chance. Let's move." The platoon broke camp in under 3 minutes, a testament to their training. But as they descended toward the Eastern Pass, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The hostile force had split, with one element moving to cut off their escape route. "They knew we were here," Grace realized aloud. This wasn't a patrol. It was a trap. The first shots rang out when they were halfway through the pass. Private Lisa Chun dropped without a sound, killed instantly by a sniper's bullet. The narrow canyon walls erupted with gunfire as the enemy opened up from multiple positions. "Ambush! Take cover!" Grace shouted, her training taking over. But there was precious little cover in the pass. The platoon scattered, trying to find positions behind rocks and outcroppings. The enemy fire was devastating, precise, coordinated. These weren't amateurs. Grace's radio crackled with desperate voices. "Sullivan, we're pinned down on the left flank. Man down. We need a medic. They're flanking us from the ridge." She moved through the chaos, directing fire, coordinating defensive positions, trying to keep her soldiers alive. Sergeant Bennett fought beside her, his rifle barking steadily. Corporal Martinez carried a wounded soldier to cover, then returned to the fight without hesitation. But the numbers were impossible. For every enemy soldier they dropped, 3 more appeared. The afternoon sun painted everything in harsh gold light, and the air filled with smoke and the screams of the wounded. "Fall back to the secondary position." Grace ordered, identifying a small rise that might offer better defense. Her platoon fought their way backward, step by bloody step. That's when the mortar rounds started falling. The first explosion killed 4 soldiers instantly. The second wounded 6 more. Grace felt shrapnel tear through her left shoulder, but adrenaline kept her moving. She returned fire, dragged wounded soldiers to cover, and kept calling for air support that seemed to take forever to arrive. By the time the attack helicopters finally screamed overhead, only 6 members of Grace's platoon were still fighting. The Apache gunships tore into the enemy positions with devastating effect, but the damage was already done. As dusk fell and the battlefield grew quiet, Grace walked among the fallen. 18 soldiers dead, 6 critically wounded. Her platoon, her responsibility, was destroyed. Sergeant Bennett sat against a rock, holding pressure on a stomach wound. He looked up at Grace with fading eyes. "Not your fault, Lieutenant," he whispered. "You gave us a chance. That's all anyone could do." He died before the medical evacuation helicopter arrived. Grace stood alone among the bodies of her soldiers as darkness settled over the mountains. She'd failed them. She'd brought them here, and now most of them were dead. The weight of it crushed her chest, made breathing feel impossible. The evacuation helicopter took the wounded away. Grace stood in the landing zone, covered in blood, some hers, mostly belonging to others. A young medic approached her. "Ma'am, you need to board. We have to go." Grace looked back at the battlefield one last time, at the positions where her soldiers had fought and died, at the ground stained with their sacrifice. "Lieutenant?" The medic pressed. Grace's jaw tightened. Something had changed inside her in those terrible hours. The quiet, reserved officer who worried about earning respect was gone, burned away by gunfire and loss. "Go," she said quietly. "I'm not finished here." The medic stared at Grace as if she'd lost her mind. "Ma'am, you can't stay here. The enemy could return at any moment." "Then I suggest you leave quickly," Grace replied, her voice flat and emotionless. She'd already made her decision. The part of her that felt fear, that calculated survival odds, had shut down completely. All that remained was a cold, burning purpose. "Lieutenant Sullivan, I have orders to evacuate all personnel. I'm giving you a direct order, Corporal. Take the wounded and go. Now." The helicopter lifted off minutes later, its lights disappearing into the night sky. Grace stood alone in the darkness, surrounded by the bodies of her soldiers. The mountain wind carried the scent of blood and gunpowder. She had no backup, no extraction plan, no support, just her rifle, 5 magazines of ammunition, her sidearm, and a rage so pure it felt like ice in her veins. Grace moved through the battlefield methodically, gathering supplies from the fallen, both her own soldiers and the enemy dead. Extra ammunition, grenades, medical supplies, water, food rations. She worked by moonlight, her movements precise and unhurried. Her wounded shoulder screamed with pain, but she'd field-dressed it and pushed the sensation into a distant corner of her mind. By midnight, she'd prepared 3 different cache points with supplies and established a mental map of every position, every sight line, every approach to the kill zone. Then she settled into a concealed position overlooking the valley and waited. The enemy returned at dawn, exactly as she'd predicted. They came to collect their own dead and search for intelligence among the American casualties. Grace counted 37 hostiles in the group, moving with the confidence of victors. She let them enter the kill zone, let them spread out, lower their guard. Then she opened fire. The first 3 went down before the others realized they were under attack. Grace shifted positions immediately, moving to her second prepared spot before return fire could find her. She fired again, dropping 2 more, then moved again. The enemy force scattered, trying to locate her, but Grace had spent the night memorizing every shadow, every angle. She knew this ground now like she knew her own heartbeat. She was the terrain itself, appearing and disappearing like smoke dot. By noon, 12 enemy soldiers lay dead. The others had retreated, confused and demoralized. Grace allowed herself a brief moment to eat and hydrate, then prepared for their return. Because they would return, military pride demanded it. They came back that evening with reinforcements, nearly 60 fighters. They believed overwhelming force would root her out. They were wrong. Grace had spent the afternoon setting traps and preparing fallback positions. She'd learned something profound in the last 24 hours. When you have nothing left to lose, when you've already paid the highest price, you become something the enemy cannot predict or defeat. You become inevitable. The battle that followed was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare. Grace struck and vanished, leading the enemy through a maze of their own dying. She used their anger against them, their need for revenge. Every time they thought they'd cornered her, she materialized somewhere else, her rifle speaking death before melting back into shadow. By the third day, she'd stopped counting. Her world had narrowed to simple mathematics: target acquisition, shot placement, displacement, survival. She ate cold rations in hidden positions, slept in 30-minute intervals, moved constantly. Her radio had been damaged in the initial firefight, so she had no communication with base. She was completely alone, fighting a private war in these hostile mountains. But something had been released inside her, something primal and unstoppable. On the fourth night, she lay in a concealed position, watching the enemy camp in the valley below. They'd brought in what looked like a full company now, maybe 150 fighters, determined to eliminate the ghost that haunted their operations. Grace's ammunition was running low. Her body was failing, running on nothing but willpower and the memory of 23 dead soldiers who deserved justice. But she wasn't done. Not yet. She waited until 3 a.m., when human vigilance is at its lowest. Then she moved into the enemy camp like death itself, her knife doing the work her dwindling ammunition could not. She moved between tents and sleeping positions with supernatural silence. The skills she practiced 10,000 times in training finally earning their terrible purpose. By dawn, when the camp woke to discover 11 of their fighters dead in their sleep, the enemy had reached a breaking point. This wasn't a soldier they were fighting anymore. This was a demon, a nightmare that couldn't be killed or captured. They began to retreat from the valley, pulling back to safer positions. But Grace followed. She'd become something beyond human now, beyond tired, beyond broken. She was vengeance in human form, and she would not stop until the debt was paid. On the 7th day, reconnaissance drones finally spotted her, or what remained of her. A gaunt figure moving through the mountains, still armed, still fighting. The footage was transmitted back to Fort Carson, where Colonel Hendricks watched in stunned silence. "How many?" she asked quietly. The intelligence officer checked his report. "Ma'am, based on enemy communications we've intercepted and drone surveillance, Lieutenant Sullivan has 43 confirmed hostile kills, operating alone. For 7 days." The room fell silent. "Get her out of there," Hendricks ordered. "Whatever it takes, bring her home." The extraction team found Grace on the 8th day. She was positioned in a rocky outcrop, barely conscious, her rifle trained on an empty valley. When the Special Forces team called out to her, she nearly shot them before recognizing American uniforms. "Lieutenant Sullivan, we're here to bring you home," the team leader said gently. Approaching her like one might approach a wounded animal, Grace lowered her rifle slowly. "My platoon," she whispered, her voice raw from days without speaking. "Did they make it? The wounded?" "4 survivors, ma'am. They're safe at base." Something in Grace's expression cracked, then the first emotion she'd shown in days. 4, she repeated. 20 lost. The flight back to Fort Carson took 3 hours. Grace sat in silence, staring at nothing. The Special Forces medic tried to treat her wounds, but she barely seemed to notice. She'd lost 20 pounds. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow. But something burned in those eyes that made even the hardest soldiers look away. When the helicopter landed at Fort Carson, Colonel Hendricks was waiting. So was Captain Morton and half the base command staff. Word of what Grace had done had spread through the military network like wildfire. 43 confirmed hostile kills, alone, after losing her entire platoon. But Grace didn't want a welcome party. She walked past the gathered officers without acknowledgement, heading straight for the hospital where her surviving soldiers were being treated. Private First Class Angela Rodriguez was the first one Grace found. She'd lost her right leg below the knee in the ambush. When Grace entered her room, Rodriguez's eyes filled with tears. "Lieutenant, they told us you were dead. They told us you died with the others." Grace sat beside the bed. "I'm sorry, Rodriguez. I'm so sorry I couldn't save everyone." "Save us?" Rodriguez shook her head. "Ma'am, you saved 4 of us. The medic said without you organizing that defense, we'd all be dead. You gave us a chance when there was no chance." Grace visited each survivor. Each conversation was harder than the last. They all said the same thing. She'd given them a chance. She'd fought for them. She'd done everything humanly possible. But Grace couldn't hear it. All she saw were the 20 faces that wouldn't be coming home. The debriefing came 2 days later. Grace sat in Colonel Hendricks' office, still wearing her hospital gown, refusing to wait for full medical clearance. The colonel studied her with an expression Grace couldn't read. "The preliminary investigation is complete," Hendricks said. "The intelligence failure that led to your platoon's ambush has been identified. The enemy force was 3 times larger than reported, and they'd been planning that operation for weeks. You walked into a trap that should never have existed." Grace said nothing. "Furthermore," Hendricks continued, "your decision to hold position instead of immediately retreating has been questioned by some officers. Captain Morton has filed a formal complaint suggesting your tactical choices contributed to the casualty rate." Now Grace looked up. "Is that his professional opinion?" "He believes a more experienced officer would have handled the situation differently. He's entitled to his opinion, ma'am." Grace's voice was flat, emotionless. 20 of my soldiers are dead. Whatever punishment you decide on, it won't be worse than what I'm already living with." Hendricks leaned forward. "You misunderstand me, Lieutenant. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to tell you that the enemy communications we've intercepted are terrified of you. They call you the ghost that walks. They've abandoned that entire valley because they believe it's cursed. And the tactical analysis of your solo operations over those 7 days is being studied at West Point as an example of the most effective guerrilla warfare conducted by a single soldier in modern military history." Grace felt nothing. Accolades meant nothing when weighed against 20 lives. "There's going to be a ceremony," Hendricks said. "You're being recommended for the Silver Star, possibly more. The Secretary of Defense himself wants to meet you." "I don't want medals," Grace said quietly. "I want my soldiers back." "I know," Hendricks replied, her voice softening. "But that's not how this works. You did your duty under impossible circumstances. You survived when you should have died. And whether you want to accept it or not, you've become a symbol. A symbol of what? Failure? A symbol of courage, of resilience, of what one soldier can accomplish when everything falls apart." Hendricks stood. "Take some time, Lieutenant. Process this. But understand something. Those 20 soldiers didn't die because you failed. They died because they walked into an ambush that no one could have predicted or prevented. And 4 soldiers are alive because of your leadership and your sacrifice." After Grace left the colonel's office, She walked across the base to the memorial wall where names of fallen soldiers were inscribed. Soon, 20 new names would join that wall. Her responsibility. Her ghost. Captain Morton was there, studying the wall with his hands behind his back. He turned when he heard Grace approach. "Sullivan," he said coldly, "I suppose you're quite proud of yourself. A war hero now." Grace looked at him with eyes that had seen things Morton couldn't imagine. 19 years old, she said quietly. That's how old Martinez was. Chun was 22. Bennett had 3 kids. So no, Captain, I'm not proud. I'm destroyed. But I'm still standing, and they're not. So I'll carry that weight until the day I die. Morton's expression flickered. I filed my report. Your tactical decisions will be reviewed. Good, Grace said. I hope they find I made mistakes. I hope they court-martial me. Because living with this is worse than any punishment the Army could devise. She turned to face him directly. You wanted to know if I was tough enough for combat, Captain. Now, you know, I'm tough enough to lose everyone I was supposed to protect and still keep fighting. I'm tough enough to kill 43 human beings and feel nothing but emptiness. I'm tough enough to stand here and not put a bullet in my own head. Is that tough enough for you? For the first time, Morton had no response. He simply walked away, leaving Grace alone with the wall and her ghosts. 3 weeks after the ambush, the ceremony took place. Grace stood on the parade ground in her dress uniform, her left arm still in a sling, as generals and dignitaries praised her courage and tactical brilliance. They pinned the silver star on her chest. Cameras flashed. Soldiers saluted. Grace felt none of it. She was somewhere else back in that mountain pass, watching her soldiers fall. What the Army didn't announce publicly was the second part of their investigation. The intelligence failure that had sent Grace's platoon into an ambush wasn't just incompetence. It was something worse. Colonel Hendricks called Grace into a secure briefing room 2 days after the ceremony. We've identified the source of the faulty intelligence, she said grimly. It was deliberately falsified. Grace's hands clenched. By who? A contractor working with enemy forces. He fed us bad information, ensured your platoon would be in that valley at that exact time. It wasn't random, Sullivan. You were targeted specifically. Why? Because someone wanted to prove a point about women in combat leadership. They wanted a failure they could point to, a disaster they could use to push their agenda. Hendrix's expression was pure rage. They murdered 20 American soldiers to make a political statement. The room spun. Grace gripped the table to steady herself. Tell me you caught him. Special Forces picked him up in Karachi 3 days ago. He's talking. The full scope of the conspiracy is still being uncovered, but it goes deep. Military contractors, foreign agents, possibly even American officers working to undermine integration efforts. Names, Grace said, her voice deadly quiet. I want names. That's not how this works, Lieutenant. There will be trials, investigations. Colonel, with respect, those investigations will take years. Appeals, lawyers, bureaucracy. Meanwhile, the people who killed my soldiers will be sitting in comfortable cells eating 3 meals a day. Hendricks studied her carefully. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, ma'am. I'm just stating a fact. The investigation did take years. But during those years, something strange began to happen. The people involved in the conspiracy started having accidents. Car crashes. Sudden illnesses. Unexplained disappearances in foreign countries where American law didn't reach. Grace Sullivan was never anywhere near these incidents. She was always on base, always accounted for, always following orders. But those who knew her, truly knew her, saw the truth in her eyes. She'd learned something in those 7 days alone in the mountains. That justice and law were not always the same thing. 5 years after the ambush, Grace stood before a different kind of ceremony. The families of her fallen soldiers had gathered to dedicate a memorial, not at the base, but in the mountains where their loved ones had died. Grace had privately funded an expedition to install a bronze plaque at the site, inscribed with all 23 names. Private Rodriguez was there, walking confidently on her prosthetic leg. The other 3 survivors came too. They all stood together as a priest blessed the memorial. They were heroes, Grace said when it was her turn to speak. Every single one of them fought with courage and honor. They trusted me to lead them, and I led them into hell. That's something I live with every day. But I want you to know, I want all of you to know that their deaths were not meaningless. The conspiracy that targeted them has been exposed. The people responsible are facing justice. And the military has implemented new oversight procedures to ensure this never happens again. After the ceremony, Rodriguez approached Grace. Captain Sullivan now, she corrected herself, noting Grace's promotion. Can I ask you something? Of course. Those 7 days you spent alone up here, what kept you going? How did you not just give up? Grace looked out over the valley where so much blood had been spilled. I made them a promise, she said quietly. Every single soldier I lost. I promised them that their deaths would mean something, that the people responsible would pay, that their families would know the truth. So I kept fighting, because stopping would have meant breaking that promise. And now? Is the promise fulfilled? Grace was silent for a long moment. Almost, she finally said. There's still one name left on my list. But he's in a country we don't have an extradition treaty with, living under protection of a foreign government. Rodriguez nodded slowly. I'm sure the army is working on diplomatic solutions. I'm sure they are, Grace agreed. Then she smiled a cold expression that never reached her eyes. I'm being deployed again next month. Classified mission. Somewhere in Southeast Asia. Rodriguez understood without another word being spoken. She extended her hand. Good hunting, ma'am. Thank you, Rodriguez. That night, as Grace sat alone in her quarters at Fort Carson, she opened her footlocker and carefully cleaned her rifle, the same weapon she'd carried through those 7 days in hell. She'd been offered newer models, better equipment, but she kept this one. It had history. It had purpose. On her desk was a photo of her platoon, taken the morning before deployment. 23 faces smiling at the camera, full of life and hope. Grace touched each face gently. Almost done, she whispered to them. One more, and we'll be square. Outside her window, the Colorado night was clear and cold. Somewhere across the world, a man who thought he was safe was about to learn an important lesson. Grace Sullivan always kept her promises. The quiet girl from Millbrook was gone. The officer who worried about earning respect had died in that mountain pass. What remained was something far more dangerous, a soldier who had nothing left to lose and everything left to avenge. Captain Derek Morton, who'd been quietly forced into early retirement after his role in the conspiracy came to light, sat in his house outside Norfolk, Virginia. He was drinking his evening whiskey when his phone rang. Morton, he answered. Captain Morton, a voice said, female, calm, familiar. Do you remember telling me I was too soft for combat? Morton's blood went cold. Sullivan, I just wanted you to know, Grace continued, her voice perfectly pleasant, that you were right. The old me was too soft. But she's gone now. You helped kill her in that valley. So thank you for that. Is that a threat? No, sir. Just a courtesy call. Sleep well, Captain. The line went dead. Morton sat in his chair for a long time, staring at his phone. Then he stood, checked every lock on every door and window, and didn't sleep at all that night, because somewhere out there, moving through a world that would never fully understand what she'd become, Grace Sullivan was keeping her promises. And nothing, not distance, not politics, Not law itself would stop her until the last name was crossed off her list. The mountain ghost was still walking, still fighting, still serving justice in the only way she knew how. 23 lives demanded payment, and Grace Sullivan always paid her debts. Always. The end.